Welcome to the Take the North podcast. I'm David Haugh on the Mully and Haugh Show on 670 The Score. Dan Wiederer is from the Chicago Tribune, covers the Bears down at the NFL Combine in Indianapolis. You can listen to us at the Take the North podcast on your free Odyssey app, or you can watch us on the 670 The Score YouTube page. Busy week in Indy, Dan. You're doing a great job down there, but there has been a lot of interesting stories, good developments in terms of other prospects and what the Bears are doing, who they're talking to. They're playing darts in Ryan Poles' room. But the whole new cycle hijacked by the Jalen Carter development. That is the biggest story in the NFL this week. It's big enough that it was on the network newscasts on Wednesday night when it broke. So how would you describe the week that you've had and how the Jalen Carter news has affected everything else?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the Jalen Carter news, because obviously that's the most landmark thing that has happened down here in Indianapolis this week. And you have a player that was in line to be the number one overall pick and certainly in consideration for that slot, having to return to Georgia and turn himself in and post bail and be arrested on 2 misdemeanor charges in conjunction with a connection with a fatal car accident. And so it's a very messy, evolving, fluid situation that a lot of teams now have to spend a lot of extra time and effort getting their arms around, right? This is going to be a stretch here in the next 2 months where the comfort level of teams is going to be tested, and there's going to have to be very serious internal discussions that involve people above the front office in a lot of buildings to try to figure out how do you process this situation with Jalen Carter. How does it affect what you do with your decisions heading into the draft? Certainly the Bears are right in the epicenter of that entire discussion.
So we're going to get into all of that with the details. We are also going to talk about who the Bears have maybe talked to this week and the impression some other guys have made. We'll get into your deep dive in the Chicago Tribune and chicagotribune.com about Justin Fields and what the book is on Justin Fields. You talked to a lot of people and got some really great stuff. It's a long read, but it's worth your time. Let's start with the Jalen Carter stuff, though, because he, on March 1st, goes back. He, first of all, leaves Indianapolis after the story breaks at 9 o'clock in the morning. He leaves the Combine, returns to Athens, Georgia. By that night, I think around 10:45 on Wednesday night, he turns himself in. The arrest warrant is issued. He spends 16 minutes in police custody at the Athens Clark County Jail. He's charged with misdemeanor charges of reckless driving and racing, pays $4,000 bond, and he's out. And then there are reports that has returned to Indianapolis for measurements and interviews. First of all, before we get into the implications, I don't know who's giving him advice, because he issued a statement, all caps, on social media that he will be exonerated. And then he goes down, pays his bond, and returns for interviews, probably going to be asked questions he can't possibly answer. I just think overall, Dan, this is a very curious story about somebody making some very questionable decisions, and he continues to make them.
They're trying not to hide from it at a time that's very pivotal in the direction of where this young man's football life is going to head. But there's obviously more serious topics here. And that's why it is, David, so complex and so layered. And there are so many things that teams have to figure out how to get comfortable with. Even before this story came out this week, I had people I entrust implicitly in the league say, look, like, this kid has maturity issues. There are some things that are high maintenance about him that you're going to have to, as an organization, try to sort through and get your arms around. This complicates that 10-fold, 20-fold, 30-fold, whatever it may be, because now you're trying to look more deeply into a situation where there were people who lost their lives and people that were part of the same Georgia Bulldogs football program that Jalen Carter played in. And there are a lot of mysterious question marks in there. I understand the approach to try to hit this head on and not hide from it. And I think that's some of the decision making that's going on with Jalen Carter and his camp. But there is no easy solution. And it is a very tricky thing to go through. And like we say, today, as we record this episode, it's March 2nd. And you're talking about the NFL draft now, about 8 weeks away for everybody involved to try to get their arms around a situation that is, again, fluid, evolving, and may only get messier from here.
I don't know how you treat this like somebody who got busted with pot in his back pocket.
Correct.
Or drinking and even pulled over for DWI, whatever the case may be. This is something that he is accused of, according to the police report. This isn't us, making things up. According to the police report, he drove away from the scene of an accident that resulted in the fatalities of what you just described. 2 young people lost their lives. Jalen Carter left the scene. Then he returned. Then he lied to police. Then he kept quiet. And this was all kept very quiet up to the point where Jalen Carter meets with the general manager of the Carolina Panthers on Tuesday night. This doesn't come up because nobody's aware that there's an arrest warrant issued for Jalen Carter. If you're Jalen Carter, don't you have some sort of obligation to at least say, hey, if you do take me, this might be around the corner? I just don't know if there's any accountability. So I think that there are some serious questions about his character that already existed that are now compounded. And Dan, I think that, again, there are all kinds of issues that already with the legal jeopardy that he might find himself in, but the civil litigation remains unresolved. If you draft Jalen Carter, you better be ready for crisis management 101, because you're going to deal with issues. Number one, this one, and then who knows what's coming next.
Well, so there's a couple parts to this. And number one, like on Wednesday morning, Nolan Smith, who's a standout on that Georgia defense, does his interview session here at the Combine and stands up at the podium and basically says, this is the first time I've talked about this openly, about this car accident in which we lost people that were close to us in our football program. And he starts breaking down a little bit and shedding some tears over a very, very serious situation. And so it traces back to kind of this balance beam that everyone has to walk here in understanding that this is a very serious real life situation that now has also bled into the world of football, which it can be really hard to juggle those two things at once. That is something the Chicago Bears have to do now going forward here and figure this out. And we don't have a track record with Ryan Poles to know what his level of risk aversion is or risk tolerance is, right? And so this period of free agency in the draft that's going to come up here in the next 2 months will be a test of you can talk all about culture and character. Your actions with who you sign and what you're willing to reward them with will speak to that. And like his predecessor, right? Like Ryan Pace, for the most part, stood behind his belief that we're not going to bring in guys with messy pasts, and yet went out and signed Ray McDonald in one of his first major moves, and that obviously blew up in their face fairly quickly. They had to release Ray McDonald, and everything went haywire. And so there are these tests here for a young, unproven general manager to sort through and figure out, what do we want to do here? I think, David, my hunch, and you can tell me if you agree or not, is that the Bears are going to steer way away from Jalen Carter here, regardless of how talented they see him on film and understanding of how disruptive he could be on their defense.
Well, I was curious what your hunch would be, because that would be mine. And it's only based on the fact that maybe I can't get past this kind of philosophical, psychological barrier where I can't really rationalize how they would do anything except for be ultra cautious and stay away. And you mentioned the McDonald situation. I know that George McCaskey prides himself in hiring people and letting them do their jobs and staying out of football business and matters like that. But he can't possibly withhold that kind of information, or he can't possibly sit back and not share that experience with Ryan Poles. And number one, how badly it backfired on the Bears organization. And secondly, how badly it backfired on George McCaskey in terms of his damage to his reputation. He went in, and then it didn't pay off. I think that's got to be part of this. If they're having this conversation in the Bears organization at Haugh or whatever they're doing about what to do about Jalen Carter, that's got to come up.
In conjunction with that, David, Kevin Warren was hired in part to help be a sounding board for Ryan Poles in complicated decisions and have discussions that stimulate productive thought as you work forward toward those decisions that can be truly landmark in a lot of different ways. And so you would think, Kevin Warren hasn't officially started on the job, but you would think that those phone lines are open and Ryan Poles should be on the phone with, who is going to be his direct overseer to talk about this and say, hey, here's how we've got him graded. Here were some of our concerns. Is this a situation where we take him completely off the board? Because again, we're talking about a possibility where the Bears trade down, right? And then maybe they get outside the top 5. And there's now a possibility that Jalen Carter will be sliding down the draft board because teams will say, not interested, not going to take that risk. And so now that discussion becomes not just a guy that would you consider taking him at 1 or 2? What if he's there at 9 and you've gotten your way back to 9? Well, now you've got a whole different equation to sort through. But to your point, I don't think you can stand up there for a year plus if you're Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus and talk about culture and talk about principles and talk about having guys in that building that do everything the right way, and then make this one of your biggest headline-grabbing acquisitions of the biggest offseason of the 21st century for the Chicago Bears.
You're trying to build credibility, not destroy it. And I just don't know how you build it if you contradict everything that you claim to have stood for in the first year on the job. And that is as simple as that. And to refresh the memory of some Bears fans who might be thinking, what the heck are they talking about, Ray McDonald? Okay, it is going back a ways. It's going back to 2015.
Was it 15? Yeah, so that's Ryan's first year. Yeah,
it was Ryan Pace's first year when he was trying to build his own platform and talking about the things that, the platitudes that young general managers talk about before they have to get their hands dirty a little bit. March 24th, 2015, Ray McDonald signs with the Bears. He had some things in his past. He was reported to being investigated for a possible sexual assault. There was some things that with the 49ers he encountered. The Bears signed him anyway on March 24th, 2015. On May 25th, about 2 months later, he was released after being arrested on charges of domestic violence and child endangerment. So he ran into trouble again. And
that was it.
That was it. And George McCaskey, at the time that they signed him, had vouched for him, if I recall correctly.
Correct.
And it was something that backfired. And it should be a lesson that they don't forget, even though it was 8 years ago.
As a beat guy, you remember where you were on the dates that you just mentioned. That the signing occurred while we were at the owners' meetings in Phoenix, Arizona. And I recall having this emergency session with George McCaskey because someone from the organization had to come forward and explain how they found themselves to a comfort level in making the signing to begin with. And if you remember, George kind of stepped in it in that session and saying, listen, like, we spoke to Ray's parents and they speak very highly of him. Well, there probably were 4 or 5 other people that you probably wanted to reach out to and get some thoughts on before you made a signing that large. Then you mentioned May of when the next legal transgression occurred, and that's Memorial Day. It was literally Memorial Day weekend. I recall being out playing golf with my family and being like, oh, this is one of those NFL stories. Stop everything you're doing. Ray McDonald is in legal trouble, and we're going to see if the Bears truly had a zero tolerance policy with having him there. He was quickly out the door, never played a snap as a Chicago Bear. And that, like you said, it was embarrassing for the franchise. It was also embarrassing on a level that's like 5 levels below what we're talking about with Jalen Carter, who, if you were to draft him, would become one of the, I don't want to say faces or voices of the franchise, but he'd be one of the guys that you're plastering on billboards, right? Like, and saying this is one of our key acquisitions. And that, I don't know, would sit real well with a leadership team that wants to build something according to a vision of like, we're going to do everything correct.
Oh yeah, I remember where I was when Ray McDonald got cut because it was Memorial Day weekend. I was in Anaheim covering the Blackhawks against the Ducks for the Tribune, and I wasn't happy having to write a Ray McDonald column before watching a little hockey. Don't interrupt my hockey.
Tell me about it.
You're right about Jalen Carter. When you're talking about next year and you're talking about this rebuild and the project and how immense it is, you want people at the front of it that will help you sell hope, not cynicism. You need somebody to kind of change the narrative, not repeat history. And I think that's the part that is hard to quantify, but easy to identify, right? Because Jalen Carter at the front of this, because of everything he's going through now, and frankly, the stuff that was already kind of whispered behind the scenes, tells me if I'm the Bears, no matter how dangerous that's the wrong word, no matter how disruptive of a football player he can be, I don't know if you are in a position where you can take that risk.
Well, I don't think we're going to get a lot of clarity on this until after the draft ends. It doesn't really benefit the Bears to even on background sort of administer where they are in their philosophies and their thought processing on this very specific matter. But I do think that when we get beyond the draft, there are going to be opportunities to be like, okay, how did you guys sift through that, right? And then get some more clarity to what their processes were and what they thought. And those sessions can be very telling about the way a regime wants to operate and the vision they have and how they, navigate around obstacles. And this is a big one. And to go along with that, David, I think there is this, there's been a consensus that defensively, the top 2 guys in the draft are Jalen Carter and Will Anderson. And then you sit and you listen to Will Anderson talk on Wednesday and you feel his passion for the game. You feel his commitment to work. You feel all of the things that Matt Eberflus says he wants in a football player just oozing off of Will Anderson. And you say, okay, this also helps you get comfortable in making a decision on Jalen Carter because you have another option potentially if you're going to stay at number one or depending on where you move back to. That makes perfect sense, and that you would have zero regret on rolling the dice. Whether it worked out or not, you would look back and say, well, we don't regret that. And so sometimes regret factor comes into these decisions on if it fails, why will it fail? And did we see the failure coming in advance? And with Jalen Carter, it's obviously a lot messier than it would be with a guy like Will Anderson.
Will Anderson seemed like he was straight out of Central Casting
for the Bears, right? Like just
the ideal front man for this kind of project, the ideal guy you put in a locker room, and he says, "Follow me." He's young, he's aggressive, he's dynamic, he's got charisma. Everything that he said during his podium time, you're like nodding your head. Yeah, I want that guy. Football guy's football guy. I mean, this is who you want leading the charge. One more little question, detail wise, about Jalen Carter. He came back to Indianapolis to meet with teams and to be measured and all the different things at the combine. I think that's bad advice. It doesn't matter what I think. Are the Bears among the teams, to your knowledge, that were on the list to meet with Jalen Carter?
I do not know. And so we'll dig around on that a little bit more. We'll see how this unfolds before this event ends. And then it's all about figuring out what the next steps are. You'd imagine there's going to be some activity at Georgia for a pro day. There's going to be a lot of opportunity. The Bears will have an opportunity to bring Jalen Carter into their building at some point on a top 30 visit, if so desired. And that would give them more time and full day to try to digest some of this. It's going to be really compelling to figure out which direction they go with this, and then to kind of hear their explanations for how they went with it.
So if they do remove him from the draft board, Dan, and you're talking about Will Anderson being likely to be the number one position player, maybe the number one player overall on their draft board, and what that does is it devalues the top of the draft, which isn't good for the Bears. But to me, I think it sets up a quantity versus quality debate, or it crystallizes that, because the quantity you could look at, all right, if you're number one and there's only Will Anderson to maybe choose from, or not to choose from, but is there without Jalen Carter, do you trade down and accumulate picks because you need volume, you need talent, you're so bereft of everything on your depth chart? Or the quality of a Will Anderson, if he's the next Micah Parsons, if he's a guy that you think is a generational talent, do you go no lower than 2 with the Texans and guarantee that you're going to get him? Because if you don't, if you think that the Cardinals won't take him, I think you're being foolish, because they likely would. So does it change your thinking to that degree? Is it, quantity versus quality, no lower than 2 versus going into the teens? Is it that kind of debate now?
Well, I think it was always going to be that kind of debate, and I think they have to just get themselves comfortable with a lot of different guys, right? And I think that's one of the challenges that Ryan Poles and his staff have, is to put together a best case vision and then another vision and be really, really satisfied with all the visions they lay out, because there's going to be a lot of things that are out of their control that will dictate kind of which path they need to go down. I do think that this team is very accepting of their current plight, and their current plight is that they need players on every level of every unit of their football team. And so they understand that quantity argument and are very ready to move in a direction if those options present themselves, to add as many possible players as possible over the one quality guy. I think it would have to be a super, super special situation where you say 100% we want that guy, and we're willing to sacrifice the promise of potentially getting 3 or 4 other guys this year, next, and possibly in 2025.
Impossible to answer, but then does it diminish or devalue what that pick is eventually worth? Because if Jalen Carter is still a football player that somebody's going to draft, but he's likely to drop because his value in character has now not what it was a week ago or before these charges, does it diminish and devalue the number one pick and what the Bears are going to be able to get for that pick? So they might have to, dare I say, settle for maybe the best offer, and it might not be as good as it would have been made before all this news broke.
So there's 2 parts to that. I think the idea that likely to fall label is it's dependent on teams, right? Like, and if the Houston Texans just decide, hey, we do some risky things, we're going to do another one, and just decide to take him at number 2, then there you have it, right? Then he doesn't fall, and then there's things there. I think there's a sense within the league that's buzzing through here this week that the prospect of the Bears being able to fully squeeze the most out of a trade for this number 1 pick isn't maybe as large as the city of Chicago has dreamed it's going to be. Like, I don't know that the Indianapolis Colts are hell-bent on getting up the board. And some of that depends on how these quarterback evaluations shape up in the next month and how they firm up in that regard. But you've got to just be ready for the idea that some of these things that you dreamed about won't happen. And that's where I think Ryan Poles is on top of that, both in free agency and the draft, that there are some things that may not go ideally. You want the ideal things to happen, but you have to be ready if they don't. And this is one of those ones where right now, the buzz out of Indianapolis isn't like, oh my God, there's going to be a stick up for the what you can get for the number 1 pick. And so we'll see how that changes in the weeks to come.
I think you heard some of that from Chris Ballard, whether or not
yes.
he's posturing or not, but it did make a point and reinforce what you just said. I also wonder if it did bring the Bears, if we're not going to be fixated on either Jalen Carter or Will Anderson, you start to consider other possibilities. Tyree Wilson is a gargantuan defensive lineman, 6'6", 276 pounds from Texas Tech. He also made a strong impression, Dan. I sense that you were probably there or aware of what he had to say. How would you describe the impact he made this week and how much he might have helped himself?
Look, I mean, I think that's a guy with some of that think big ambition, and a guy who openly would talk about the Chicago Bears and saying, like, if I was in line to be selected by them either at 1, 6, 8, 9, whatever it may be, like, I'm ready to come in and be an engine for what you're trying to build there. That's a guy that you talk to talent evaluators, and Daniel Jeremiah, the NFL Network, has said this for weeks now, that like there is an increasing buzz that the gap between Will Anderson and Tyree is not as large as maybe you thought 2-3 months ago, and that you put on the tape and you understand why, because there are things here that we talk about traits and training, right? And he's got traits, and if you can put him in a system that allows him to be trained to bring out the most in those traits on the NFL level, then you feel really good. And some staff somewhere is going to see that and say, we can work with this. We can take this block of clay and turn this into something wonderful. And so he's going to be a real interesting name, because I think you're going to start to hear his name more and more as we lead up to the draft. And all of a sudden he's going to be one of those guys that catches that. I never like the phrase shooting up the draft board, because that, as well as I do, that doesn't really happen. It's just the phrase shooting up the draft board means more people are talking out loud about so-and-so, right? And that's right. Really what that means. And I think he's going to be one of those.
I want to leave plenty of time for the Justin Fields story. I only have one more direct question about the draft and what this implications might be from this week. Back in 2016, the Rams moved up from 15 to number 1. They made the trade for Jared Goff because they were fixated on him. And the Titans were willing to go lower because they felt like they didn't need a quarterback at that point. They wanted to they made the deal. And now the Bears, I wonder how this affects their willingness or the likelihood that they would be willing to go into the teens or go to trade with the team down there for the right package. And if they wouldn't worry so much, as I alluded to earlier, not being in a position to take either Carter or Anderson because Carter's taken himself out of the mix. So I wonder, does that increase in your mind the number of teams that might be willing to make a deal or the Bears might be involved with in terms of bargaining? And secondly, if they do find themselves in the teens, doesn't it change the risk reward calculus? It's different when you're drafted first. It's different when you're drafted 5th.
It does. It is.
When you're in the teens, you're in a position maybe you could gamble more. I'm sorry, somebody's going to probably take Jalen Carter around that time, and you wonder if they move down, wouldn't that be something if they are still in a position to take a lesser gamble and get the same player?
Well, I don't think that there is a player in this draft that would create a move from someone in the teens to get all the way up to where the Bears are at, because the cost of it would be so prohibitive and so restrictive. And so there isn't a generational guy. Caleb Williams isn't here. Andrew Luck isn't here. There's not Peyton Manning in this draft where you say, let's do everything we can to get up there, particularly when you can move up from 23 to 12. The cost isn't anywhere near what it would be to go from like 14 to 1, and so that's where I think that would be restricted a little bit. I think you hear the Bryce Young discussion here in Indianapolis, and it's really consistent when you talk to people who know that position. And there is a belief that from a football playing standpoint, that Bryce Young is next level special. And yet people can't get around the size and whether the durability would be there for him to withstand 17 games of getting beat around by NFL level grown men, and so there's, like I said it on 670 The Score earlier on Thursday, that there's almost a frustration on, like, it's so aggravating for talent evaluators to see everything they want from a guy as a player, as a leader, as a guy who processes and sees and understands everything, but yet can't get around the measurables. And so that's going to be the one here in the coming months where it's going to be really interesting to see the team that does get itself around the measurables or talks themselves into the idea that the measurables aren't a problem, and just what that does to Bryce Young's value. Because, man, you hear some really, really high praise for just the football player himself. And I don't recall anyone in recent memory that's generated that level of just belief in who he is as a player.
All right, we're going to move on from the draft. There's going to be plenty of other times during our podcast to discuss the implications of Combine Week and what the Bears are going to do or think. And, of course, the latest on Jalen Carter right here at Take the North podcast. But in ChicagoTribune.com, dropped on Thursday morning, what's the book on Justin Fields around the NFL? The Chicago Bears quarterback has to figure out the simple to get to the next level. Deep dive, Dan. Very well done. I am very curious on number one, how you think the whole thing went down and what your biggest takeaway was. I'll tell you again, very oversimplified, brief summary of what I got out of it was thoroughly reported. That goes without saying. But when the focus and the headline was kind of like my takeaway, Justin Fields, the consensus seems to be around the league, what we saw here locally, without being critical and just being objective, he's got to do the routine things more routinely. And you do that and you combine that with the special, then you're talking about a quarterback you can win because of and certainly win with.
Well, David, now that the story is published, it's given me a chance to kind of step back from months worth of reporting. And this started for me at the end of the regular season. And you recall we played some of my training camp interview with Luke Getsy back in the summer, and kind of the bar he was setting for Justin Fields' ascent in their first season together. And the chance at the end of the year, after Justin made his final start in Detroit, to revisit with Luke kind of where he thought he went was kind of the entry point for this story, because Luke, as we've talked about many times, is very direct. He's very candid. He doesn't sugarcoat a lot of stuff. He doesn't hide a lot of stuff. And so you had this very honest, direct, on the record insight from Luke Getsy that you could then cross-check with what people around the league see, those who have played against Justin or prepared for Justin or just have studied it. Because there are people that said, look, like when you get into February and you hear these conversations on, like, there's the chance that the Bears could trade Justin Fields, of course you do a little more homework and you start watching him a little more to be like, okay, what's there and what didn't I see last season? My biggest takeaway from the entire thing, David, and I think this should give Bears fans a lot of satisfaction and just comfort, is that there is nothing that the league sees that the people at Haugh Hall don't see. There's nothing that the Bears believe inside Haugh Hall in Justin Fields that isn't acknowledged by people around the league as, yeah, that's potentially special. There's some great things to work with. And by the same token, the things that the rest of the league says, man, like, these are the flaws, these are the concern areas, the people inside the building at Haugh Hall, including Justin himself, own those, and they wrap their arms around those. And it gives you a very clear picture of who Justin Fields is now, what the Bears hope he can become, and the path to get there. And you mentioned some of it is just about, I think the phrase I used in the story was his ability, to borrow a basketball analogy, to shoot a higher percentage from inside the paint, right? Like, right. Make the easy shots. We know you can be Damian Lillard out deep on the perimeter and hit 3-pointers from 35 feet. Well, now let's figure out how to hit some mid-range jumpers every single possession, to the point where it stacks into efficiency, which then leads to points, which then leads to team success and all those things. So there's a lot there, and I've got a handful of numbers that we can go through just as we continue this discussion.
Well, I think also one of the guys you talked to said, put it in the context in terms of don't always try to create the highlight. Take the check down, because it's okay to do that. And that's part of the maturity level. I think a couple things stood out to me was that, you don't realize it because you might be in the midst of the season. And so, focused on week to week, that they didn't score more than 20 points after Thanksgiving in a game.
Right. Like honestly, David, I had to like fact check that 3 times. Really easy to do, but it didn't compute in my brain because we were stuck in this tornado of like, Justin. And you're like, they didn't touch 21 points after Thanksgiving. Like it was hard to wrap your brain around.
And related to that is that, just his numbers in the fourth quarter, they weren't good. And I think that when you talk about his growth, and we got a lot of grief about, and you especially, he needs to learn how to win in this kind of, parsing the language. It was never really about that as much as you're in the fourth quarter of games in the NFL. You've got to be better. And you just, whether it's leading a 2-minute drive or just being better in the fourth quarter, that's when you make your money. And that's when teams win their games. So I think that is, to me, also, you talk to people and it reinforced that, because around the league, they noticed the same things we saw in Chicago.
No question. And I'll just go back to this because I do think that every time we've talked to Ryan Poles, every time we've talked to Luke, anytime we've talked to Matt Eberflus, I think they have told you what the rest of the league is saying in indirect ways and direct ways at times, of saying like, look, like we love the direction Justin is headed. We're also not comfortable with where he is, right? And so there is an ownership of that like they can take this very sober view of this entire evaluation because they're not fully attached to it as if they had drafted him, right? And so they can be more grounded with it. And I think that should give you a lot of comfort as a Bears fan that they will find their way to the right assessment and that Justin's engaged on this. The other part is what you talked about, be a closer, right? Like Patrick Mahomes has music that comes on, theoretically when it's time to close games. You just know he's coming out of the bullpen. He's going to, throw 9 strikes and you're going to have a celebration at the end of it. And so Justin, to make that next jump as a quarterback, has to be situationally good. He's got to be good on third down inside the red zone. And then when you get into close games in the last 10 minutes of a football game, figure out how to close those things out. That sentiment is shared league wide on like that is a huge leap that a quarterback has to take, certainly one he can make, but that's something in 2023 that we can't get to this point next year and just be like, well, he can eventually figure it out, because it's time now for him to show like I've got the closer gene.
And the other sentiment, which we can't ignore because it's the most obvious one, I think, is that you're writing this story. The Bears are in this situation because there is this internal belief that he is their guy, because he is special. And he has this quality that you don't always count on and you're not always going to find in the draft because of what he proved beginning maybe in earnest with the night in Foxborough. And he does have these qualities that you want to and can justify building around when you give him an offensive line and you give him some weapons. Dan, I think that there's a realization that came through as you went through the entire every chapter that this is a special player. It's just finding ways to make him improve himself and also improve the team around him and be able to appreciate and benefit from those special talents.
So, right, like before I came to record this podcast, I sat with Bigsy for a little while, and Bigsy had just had a discussion in the last 24 hours with someone around the league who legitimately said, like, Justin Fields is every bit as talented, probably more so than Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts was an MVP candidate, had his team winning in the fourth quarter of a Super Bowl, or at the halftime of a Super Bowl anyway, and threw for 300 plus yards in the Super Bowl. When you hear those things as a Chicago Bears fan, you go, okay, there's a lot here. Now, the cross section of that is it is going to take the Bears an awful long time to get a roster that resembles anything like the Philadelphia Eagles had in 2022. That's not happening for the 2023 Bears. It's probably not happening for the 2024 Bears. So the Bears are going to have to make this massive decision on what Justin Fields' long-term potential is as a quarterback well before they have a roster that's able to be as good as the Philadelphia Eagles was in 2022. So we can play those comparison games, but it's just never going to be a reality game for the Chicago Bears on the timeline that that they're on. And so people have got to wrap their brains around that. I don't disagree with the idea that if Justin Fields played with the 2022 Eagles, he is more than capable of playing in the Super Bowl and being an MVP candidate. Well, now he's going to be in a situation in Chicago where he's going to be the guy that has to elevate everything around him. And Ryan, like to a lot of people's point, this puts a lot on Ryan's shoulder as well to build him the supporting cast that he needs to be a lifter, right? And a multiplier, as Ryan would call it. And so we're going to see what direction that goes. It's going to be fascinating because I think they understand that like we can't downplay the opportunity we have here to take this swing with this very special talent and this guy who showed electric playmaking ability as a runner. Well, now can he pass regularly in a way that creates NFL level passing game success?
Before we get out of here, what were some of the numbers that you think stood out to you that you wanted to accentuate, and anything else about just in the reporting that came through that maybe you weren't even able to get into the story? As long as it was, I know there's always something that doesn't make the cut.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Justin has made 25 career starts now, right? And he's got 162 passing. He averages 162 passing yards and 1 touchdown per game. I use that in the story compared against Patrick Mahomes because Patrick Mahomes is Ryan Poles' that's his background, his standard, what he's seen there. And Patrick Mahomes averages, more than 2 touchdown passes and 300 yards per game over his entire career, which is coming up on 100 starts, regular season and postseason combined. So that was like a notable, like, whoa, there's a big gap to close to get into that upper tier of, top 5 quarterbacks. I thought the one number, in addition to not touching 21 points after Thanksgiving, was breaking Justin's starts into 5 start increments and seeing that the final 5 starts in terms of production, 277 yards and 17.2 points per game, was almost identical to the first 5 starts, which was 274 yards per game and 17.2 points per game. And I think we lost that somewhere in the discussion that, my God, the end of the year struggles were as pronounced as the early year struggles. They were just kind of pushed to the background because there was that adrenaline rush for 21 days in October and November that gave people the feeling like there was a permanence to this.
We were somewhat blinded by the middle 5 games. They've created this sort of buffer
because it was so exciting. Yeah, and there was such an adrenaline rush to that. So that's part of it. I did like the analogy, and maybe because I can relate to this as a mid-40s male, that like this is like a trip to the physician when you're reviewing Justin Fields' game, and that you should see it as, okay, there's nothing that when Justin leaves the office to say, hey, head to the hospital, get some urgent testing with a specialist, you're in trouble. But there are some, hey, there's some things to keep an eye on here. And when we circle back next year, let's see if we get there. I got high cholesterol. Every year they tell me, let's see you again next year. And every year I'm right there where it's like, all right, we'll check again next year. So I'm doing a great job there. So I pat myself on the back for that. But that's something that Justin has to do, David, here is just understand that there are going to be checkpoints here in 2023 that he's going to have to reach and meet. And the Bears are going to have to be very grounded in making sure that they don't just pass him through checkpoints before he's actually passed through checkpoints. And that's being a pocket passer, right? And it's being able to hit checkdowns. And it's being able to understand that Matt Eberflus was direct publicly earlier this week and saying, look, like his scrambling ability is special, but we're trying to get him into a situation where, like, let's save it for third downs or the red zone or situations. And on first and second down, just like be more willing to just take a little drop off pass, and move on, and don't expend, which I thought was interesting from Luke, don't expend that mental and physical fuel that you expend when you're running around like that, because it does take away from the rest of the things that you can do over the course of a game and then certainly over the course of a season.
I know how it works. So you talk to a lot of people, as many as possible, and you grant them anonymity so they can be more honest and candid about what they see and think. And that's part of NFL reporting. That's part of, frankly, sports reporting. Sometimes you have to do that. Curious, though, what was the most extreme positive? Was there most extreme negative in terms of Justin Fields' opinions when you talk to guys off the record and what they were able to say? Were there somebody who thought, okay, Bears are really, this is a losing proposition, and were there others that say, God, I wish I had that guy?
No, I mean, like on the praise end of things, I think there are people that genuinely believe that if Justin has the infrastructure and the support around him, that he can be a top 5 quarterback in the NFL. Like that is what Chicago has dreamed of forever. But on the same token, there's the idea that like he could also be the 26th or 27th best quarterback in the league for a long time. And the range between those two things is so vast. And that's why I think everyone is so like fascinated to see what happens in 2023, because we're going to, I think that range is going to become less, right? Like we're going to know by January, like, okay, he doesn't have a chance to touch top 5, or there's no way he's going to be lower than 15th, right?
I've got to say this. So for people who don't have like this emotional stake in what happens, that's a great story to cover because of the ranges. Right now, we're sitting on the precipice of the unknown with Justin Fields, and he could be, as you say, some guys believe he could be a top 5 quarterback if everything comes together, or he could fizzle and they could not surround him with the right linemen or the right receivers, and they could be behind in every game, and he's a bottom 5 or bottom 10 quarterback. And I think that possibility either way makes it the most compelling story there is, and it could be, yeah.
And that, that's why that was cool, like to take this temperature at this point. I also think it's really cool to talk to Luke because, he'll acknowledge, look, he spent time around Aaron Rodgers, and he says that Aaron sees the game like different than anyone that has ever played it, but that Justin has this aptitude of like being able to communicate what he sees and why he makes decisions that's headed on the track of how Aaron sees it. And that's not true of every quarterback, that there isn't always this is why I did X or this is why I did Y, but Justin sees it all. But then he's very real in saying like seeing it and applying it in milliseconds, play after play, series after series, week after week are two totally different things. And it's why the quarterback position is so fascinating to a lot of people, because you have to not only process quickly, but then you have to react quickly. And then you have to react quickly with athleticism and precision and everything else that goes involved in it to make the right play. And it's why you go through the list of guys who have been drafted over time, and there's, 10 that we could classify as elite, and there's 150 that you're like, that guy sucked.
It was definitely worth everyone's time. It's on ChicagoTribune.com. You want to check it out. We'll have it on our Twitter feed at Take the North Pod. You'll be able to find it there easily. Get the link, read it all, and then let us know what you think with feedback via email or via the Twitter machine at Take the North Pod, or you can email us. Hold on a second, it's somewhere here. Questions at takethenorth@gmail.com. takethenorthpod@gmail.com. I think that's the correct email address. Anything else, Dan, that we have forgotten to cover? We got through a lot of stuff.
Small tease, and we'll get into this more in depth next week, but the NFLPA put out the results of a kind of a league-wide poll they took of their players, which was fascinating this week, leading into free agency. And I do like the philosophy behind this, where basically they're saying we have a responsibility to our players and our members of our union to give them as much information as possible as they go into free agency. If you're weighing offer A versus offer B, team A versus team B, well, now you know how players feel treated at each of the 32 organizations in the NFL. The Bears checked in at 13 of 32 in that poll, which is a pretty good showing for them. The Minnesota Vikings were number 1. The reason I bring that up is because to some extent, Kevin Warren's fingerprints are all over some of the things, amenities-wise and people-wise, that allowed the Minnesota Vikings to get A- or above in every single category of this poll for players who genuinely feel good going to their team every single day to work. Like I say, we'll get into this more next week because we'll be crossing that bridge into free agency. But that poll, David, was I think it was a really cool idea by the NFLPA, and there's some really, I guess, eye-opening results within that we can talk about next week.
Looking forward to that. Also, we will get to your questions. We will have a mailbag segment. There's just a lot going on. Send us your questions at our email address, takethenorthpod@gmail.com. All right, from Indianapolis, Dan Wiederer. I am in Chicago. Anything else we forgot to cover, or else we'll be back next time talking about what happened at the Combine over the weekend and then looking ahead to free agency?
Yeah, I mean, we're there. And I think, just the relevance of the Chicago Bears right now league-wide is unique, certainly during my decade on the beat. And so, like, I truly believe this week was kind of cool because the Bears have been very irrelevant during this event a lot of years. And so now you've got people seeking you out to pick your brain and ask you questions as opposed to in the past where you had to track them down. They're like, who cares about the Bears? And now it's like, what are they going to do? And so you're able to facilitate a lot more conversations just because they got that relevance going.
Download, listen, subscribe. Take the North podcast on your free Odyssey app. Watch us on the 670 The Scores YouTube page or the Odyssey YouTube page. I'm David Haugh for Dan Wiederer. Thank you for listening to Take the North Pod.
Great talk. See you out there.